Welcome fellow homeschooling students to our presentation today for Bachelor of Sports Media, our class Business in Sport. So our question today is question 1. For assessment 2, it is major tennis championships were the preserve of amateur players until 1968 when the All England Club made Wimbledon open to both amateurs and professionals. Why was this decision made? When and why did other tennis majors follow suit? Were there political issues that influenced this decision to become an open event?
But first, let's start with why the decision was made. As Schwartz explains, the International Lawn Tennis Federation has long rejected proposals for open tennis events. However, late in 1967, the wall separating amateur and professional tennis players was abolished by a vote of 295 to 5 by the British Lawn Tennis Association, creating a new era for tennis championships in England, with the world following suit thereafter.
The decision was made to stop the shamateurism that plagued the sport, that is, professional tennis players being treated as amateurs so they can play in the tournaments while receiving illegal money and incentives as a subsidy. Amateur players were also seeking exorbitant expenses to compete at many tournaments.
We must take action on our own account to make the game honest, said Derek Penham of the British Association of Tennis. For too long now, we have been governed by a set of amateur rules that are quite unenforceable.
The economics website explains how amateurs turning professional usually meant never competing in Grand Slam tournaments again due to the restrictions in place. This changed in 1968. Rod Laver, perhaps the greatest tennis player of all time, spent between 1963 and 68 on the pro circuit, thus ending his chances of adding to his already impressive litany of Grand Slam trophies.
The same could be said for Fred Perry, who turned pro in 1936. From there on, he could not add to his 8 major titles. The Australian Open was also considered not as important as the other 3, the French Open, the US Open and Wimbledon, which impacted on how many Grand Slam victories the top tennis players in the world could have won.
During the first year of the US Open becoming an open event, Arthur Ashe also became the first black male to win that particular slam tournament. According to Andrews and Jackson, Arthur Ashe emerged at a moment where tennis players could earn a legitimate living from the game and sustained a career over a decade.
Encyclopedia 2003 explains the radical changes made to tennis in the late 1960s, where Grand Slam tournaments became open to professionals. This led to dramatic changes to the tennis landscape, particularly in a professional sense. Commercial sponsors and promoters came to the game, while the rescheduling of the tournament structure led to a revised and bigger competition. The prize money on offer for winners was heightened significantly, allowing star players such as Laver, Ashe, Jimmy Connors and Billie Jean King to earn money in the hundreds of thousands by the middle of the 1970s.
Tennis was also starting to undertake other revolutionary changes during the 60s and 70s. The online encyclopedia details the shift from the wooden tennis racket to a more refined steel, aluminium and graphite version to help with the growing professionalism of the sport. Over the 2 decades, metal and wooden rackets changed to lighter, more synthetic materials, while the head of the rackets also changed in size, now varying in shape and build. The reliance on power to win matches of tennis stems from this change of racket materials.
With the introduction of professional play at Grand Slam tournaments such as Wimbledon, competition on the courts thrived for women. This step enabled the women's tour to continue holding tournaments when before tournaments were difficult to hold due to financial difficulties. Lake explains how the push to changing Grand Slam tournaments to open events was in some way influenced by Fred Perry's rise to prominence in British tennis. His decision to turn professional was covered by the American, Australian, and of course the United Kingdom tennis tournaments with great interest at the time. The attention towards professional tennis grew with Perry, as well as other amateur-turned-pro players, at the expense of recreational level tennis, leading to the change in 1968.
Communication channels between amateur and professional tennis administration were strained before the change. Lake reveals that due to amateur tennis administration not being able to have a say, the changing of tennis championships to open events could have come a lot earlier than 1968, and relationship levels would, as a result, have been better.
Another key motive for tennis Grand Slam events turning into a domain for professional players was the fact that BBC were building a large audience for major broadcasting occasions, such as Wimbledon. Professional players qualifying to play in the tournament meant a better standard of competition, therefore more viewers resulting in more money, as detailed by Wennell. So who did the professional tennis players face up against on the court if they weren't permitted to participate in the tournaments? Encyclopedia Britannica refers to how Charles C. Powell, a sports promoter from America, signed pro players and toured them to various sporting arenas, drawing successful crowds and profiles as they played against newly crowned amateur players who had turned pro.
This model continued for 40 years. Encyclopedia Britannica explores the role of Jack Kramer, who took over Powell's role following World War II. Kramer signed many amateur champions such as Ken Rosewall, Lou Howard, Tony Trebert, as well as Tony Trebert, paying them under-the-table expenses to compete professionally. This led to fierce debate about dropping the barrier between amateur and professional tennis due to the amateurism that was beginning to plague the sport. However, the proposals for change would always fall on the deaf ears of the International Lawn Tennis Federation. However, in 1967, the wall was finally dropped, and tennis tournaments such as Wimbledon and the US Open officially became open, thus marking a new era for tennis.
Encyclopedia Britannica details the first Wimbledon Open, where many former members of the All England Club were welcomed back due to the professional players now being able to play on the same court as amateur players. The total prize money for Wimbledon in 1968 was £26,150, equating to $62,760. The winner of the men's singles title, Rod Laver, received £2,000, while women's singles winner, Billie Jean King, received just £750.
After just 2 decades, the prize purse for Grand Slam tournaments winners had risen to multi-million dollars. With the commercialisation of tennis, certain political aspects started to appear. As a result, both men and women players formed the Association of Tennis Professionals, otherwise known as the ATP for men, and the Women's International Tennis Association, which is WITA.
The 4 Grand Slam tournaments we are familiar with today all became open championships at different times. Roland Garros refers to the French Open becoming the first tournament to become open in 1968, with Wimbledon and the US Open following suit. Before the Australian Open followed suit in 1969.
The struggle of Australian tennis amateurs is explored by Lunn in The Australian. He explains how Australian tennis players in the 1950s and 60s had to play against who they were told, as well as where and when, in order to be paid, and even then it would only be the top bracket of players that would be paid. As Ken Fletcher used to say, you cannot eat tennis trophies. In 1963, the Lawn Tennis Association of Australia came up with a rule that insisted on players staying in Australia for 6 months of the year. If a player ventured overseas to play tennis before March 31, they were banned from competing for the country for 1 year. This was particularly tough for some players who travelled overseas to participate in other tournaments to improve their standing in the game in order to earn more money.
Players such as Ken Fletcher, Roy Emerson, Fred Stoll, Martin Mulligan and Bob Hewitt decided to break the LTAA's restriction on travelling overseas to compete, with one player quoted as saying, "We have to be like the 5 sticks. They can break us one at a time, but not while we're all tied together." This revolt garnered plenty of media attention overseas, and with the revised Australian Open in 1969, it allowed these players to compete on their home soil for generous amounts of money, as well as explore other Grand Slam events.
Tennis professionals have their own political struggles as well, even in today's age. Even at elite level, both athlete and spectators suffer under corporate-run sport. This was exemplified by Rafael Nadal's push for less hard-court games for future players, as he believed it has created serious injury issues for him as his career has progressed. The Tennis Federation, however, would not listen to him, with players such as Roger Federer also dismissing Nadal's request to keep his squeaky clean image intact. So that concludes our video. Thanks to the students for watching, and we look forward to answering your questions.
Well, you know, you've got to take it back in its context, because it was amateur tennis. So amateur tennis really didn't mean that you were playing for prize money. You're playing for pride and, you know, and trophies. And it was really your opportunity to represent your nation.
The Australians' domination of the game coincided with the first mass push towards professionalism. But this wasn't a new idea. Big Bill Tilden had blazed a trail as early as the 1930s.
Tilden, as he advanced and got into his 30s, realized that he could make a buck off of this. And so he began to tour. Tilden gave older players an avenue to go into, and they all succeeded in. You became a champion, then you turned pro, and you had to leave the big tournaments.
I won at Wimbledon and I won the US and then won Davis Cup. And then the opportunity opened up for me to turn professional and make a career out of being a top tennis player.
Got a telephone call in New York during the US Open, I think 1967, to wonder whether I was ready to sign a contract to play professional tennis. And at that point, I was ready to give up and retire from tennis and get a real job. But I was offered $30,000, which was 4 times what I could have made in any job back in South Africa at the time. And so I signed quickly.
The divide was absolute. By turning pro and accepting payment for playing the sport, you were excluded from all of the Grand Slams, including Wimbledon. By the 1960s, the amateur game was in turmoil. The top players had all been poached by the pro tours, led by former player Jack Kramer and promoter Lamar Hunt.
By 1967, the amateur game was really needing a boost, because all the great champions had been signed to professional terms.
Turning professional wasn't an easy choice, because, you know, you're in a way you're abandoning, you know, Australia to some degree, because of Davis Cup being very important. The touring teams that started you off, taking you around the world to improve your game to represent Australia, and then you're not representing anybody when you turn professional. And so it was a tough choice, but at the same time I felt I had to do something about my future, and I thought that was, you know, a legitimate way of accomplishing it.
The latest of the promoters was WCT, Lamar Hunt's organisation, and he signed up the Handsome Eight.
Well, as personalities, we were supposed to be enthusiastic and exciting and young and handsome. That was the whole idea, was to you know, get a group of guys together that WCT could turn into personalities.
The capture of those players, who included John Newcombe, of course, and our own Roger Taylor, meant that the game now desperately needed to resolve the question of amateurism and professionalism.
Any sport in which money is being made and you're not paying the performers, but everybody else is getting money. The coaches are getting money, the presenters are getting money, the press is getting money, everybody's getting money, the people who sell the hot dogs are getting money, everybody's getting money, but the performers, I mean, that's upside down, that's insane.
The pressure reached its height when the best players in the world, players like Rod Laver and Ken Rosewall, were no longer able to play in the best championships in the world.
And it finally happened as a result of the All England Club staging in 1967 on the hallowed turf of the Centre Court a professional tournament. Shock horror.
Wimbledon and the BBC had a trial tournament, which I was the promoter and brought in the 8 best players, including Rod and Ken and Lou and Gonzalez and everybody, to find out if the fans would like to come to Wimbledon to see professionals. And we sold the place out all three days that we played, and that made it very easy for them to make the decision to go to open tennis.
It's out, and that's the championship. So a very thrilling match indeed. 6-2, 6-2. 12-10, so Rod Laver becomes the first professional champion at Wimbledon.
In the history of the game, nothing was as important as that decision.
The first Grand Slam of this brand new era was the 1968 All England Championships. Fittingly, 6 years after his last, Rod Laver, the Rockhampton Rocket, won back his men's singles title.
Victory in straight sets, 6-3, 6-4, 6-2, to become Wimbledon's first Open champion.
The amateurs were against the pros, and there was a considerable talk about the pros being overrated, and that the amateurs were going to win. They're going to beat the pros, and fortunately, we as the professionals did pretty well.
With the biggest stars back in the fold, the popularity of the championships exploded. But still the hallowed ground of Centre Court remained pristine. The All England club stayed faithful to its ethos of understated elegance to the detriment of potential advertising revenue.